see that all right? All right, so I'm assuming everyone can see that. Just let me know if you can't. Yeah, so I thought when I was asked to give a talk, I know that the club normally looks for talks that are maybe a little bit more local, but I thought with the pandemic and being sort of stuck in one place for a long time, it might be nice for me to reminisce about some trips to somewhere distant and warmer, and it might be nice for us all to just take sort of a little trip for 45 minutes to somewhere that we probably, well, just to take a trip somewhere, I guess. So I have had the pleasure of heading down to Arizona a couple times in the last few years. I went once in 2015 and once in 2019. And so this is sort of a combination of both of those adventures. And we visited a few of the same places. I went down with a few colleagues and friends. And so I'll just take you through some of those places. The focus of the trip, as I'm a herpetologist, was obviously on finding reptiles and amphibians. There tend to be a lot of other photos in here of some other creepy crawlers, some of the things we tend to find when we're looking on the ground and looking under rocks for reptiles and amphibians. I will apologize in advance, as I think there's one bird photo in total. I have a few mammals and insects and other things, but we'll jump in here. So the first place we ended up exploring on both of the trips was around the Phoenix area. And that's because when we've flown into Phoenix, it's about the easiest way to get there. Rented a car and then sort of traveled around from there. So in Phoenix, one spot that we discovered pretty early on was South Mountain Park. And this is a huge municipal park right in the city of Phoenix. It's sort of on the edge, but it's largely surrounded by development, which is unfortunate, but it is a massive park. It's one of the largest municipal parks, I think, in the United States. And so we spent a bit of time hiking around here and looking for some different critters. This park really is just completely surrounded by development. You can't see from this photo, and I don't have a photo that shows it, but to our backs here, this is my group at the time, is just residential housing. Like if you turned around and looked the other way, you would think you were in the middle of a city. And the point I wanted to make there was just one thing I found on these trips is that the wildlife, and particularly the reptiles and amphibians, and especially the reptiles, lizards, things like that, are so accessible. They are right up to and within the cities. So you don't have to drive more than 10, 15, 20 minutes to find a really nice area to go exploring and looking for things. So that was a really nice aspect of these trips, was that we could basically stay at a B&B or at a hotel somewhere, roll out of bed, have some breakfast, hop in the rental car, and within 15, 20 minutes, we were where we were going to spend the day looking around. So that was really, really nice. One of the critters that we found here quite a bit is the common chuckwalla, which is a really neat lizard. It's large. It's about the size of a bearded dragon, for those of you who are familiar with bearded dragons. And they're just out lounging around, quite common in the area. They were pretty neat to see. Very large lizard. And binoculars are not just for birds. So we would use them a lot of the times to try to spot lizards from a distance, because they are very fast, especially down here in Arizona where it's so hot. So we would often be looking ahead with binoculars, trying to spot lizards out basking on the rocks before we got too close. Here is a common side-blotched lizard, just one of the little guys that scurry around. So one neat thing for herpetologists about this part of the world is that you can't take more than a few steps without seeing a lizard or something. Like, there is just always something cool to look at. And if there's not a lizard, there's an invertebrate or a scorpion or a butterfly, or there's something. So there really was a lot of wildlife on these trips, which is really nice. This is a desert iguana, which is a relatively small lizard. And they were sort of scurrying around this one part of South Mountain Park that we were in. They were pretty neat to see. They were very colorful. The photo doesn't really do it credit. And this was a big highlight early on our first trip with the speckled rattlesnake. So we had actually gone online before we traveled down here and found a local rattlesnake expert who just happened to be in the city of Phoenix. And we'd gotten in touch with him before we traveled, just out of the blue. We didn't know him, and told him we were biologists. We were coming down to go look for reptiles and amphibians, and would he be interested in giving us a few tips? And he wrote back right away and gave us some tips, but then said, hey, let me know when you're there. I'll take you out and show you around. So he actually took us, he has a speckled rattlesnake site, or a site that he knows of, in South Mountain, that he took us to, and we searched around, and we found this beautiful snake. So we were very, very excited to find that. We probably would not have, I probably would never have seen this species if we hadn't met up with the local experts. So another thing that I think most of you obviously know is that whenever I've traveled anywhere, if I can find a local expert or a local guide to go out with, it makes a world of difference. And this is another individual that actually, as we were going to meet him at the spot he told us to meet us that morning to go look for the speckled rattlesnakes, he actually had to call his business that was volunteer at the time and is now full-time, is actually a humane rattlesnake removal business. So if people have a rattlesnake in their backyard, which happens very frequently in places like Phoenix, they call him and he comes and humanely removes it and releases it at a nearby den or somewhere that's safe. And he actually got a call on the way to meet us and had picked up this snake. So we got to see a second speckled rattlesnake. One thing you'll notice about these two photos is that this one has a lot of red coloration, and the previous one is a beautiful kind of white and blue color. And these speckled rattlesnakes, they're really, really interesting in that they have some phenotypic variation, and they tend to be, the colors that you find tend to mimic the surrounding landscape. So here, the photo doesn't show it that well, but you can see a lot of the rocks have very similar coloration. And this individual is actually very, very well camouflaged. And this snake likely would have come from an area with a lot more red rock. There's a lot of areas in Arizona with a lot of very red colored rocks. So that's a really neat thing to be able to see those different colors on the different individuals. This was a regal, I think a regal horned lizard. The Zoom banner is covering up some of my species names, so you'll just have to see it on the screen. I'm pretty sure it was the regal. And this was actually the first lizard that we saw when we were in the Phoenix area poking around before we met up with the rattlesnake expert. These things can be quite hard to see. It's actually pretty easy in this photo. It's down here. But you can see the colors and patterns. They just kind of tend to blend in with the rocks that are in the area. And you know, this photo is actually quite zoomed in already. If you're standing just walking around, these things can be very, very tricky to spot. So sometimes the best way to find them is just walk a little ways, stop, and just spend a minute just looking around. And also maybe waiting and seeing if something scurries while you're just standing there, standing still. It's a butterfly that we saw while we were out looking for things, a little fly. Just thought I'd try to mix it up a bit and not have every slide be a reptile or amphibian. So another very common site in Arizona in the Southwest are cactus, and there's so many different species. This is I believe this is the Mexican jumping cactus, and so you want to make sure you're not stepping on these. Like, we have good hiking boots, but they can still go through your boots, and you don't want to brush up against them. They break off if you even just brush up against it, and they kind of jam themselves into your leg or your arm or whatever. They're quite painful. So as you're looking around, looking for rattlesnakes and things like that, but also making sure not to walk through cacti. One thing with looking for reptiles and amphibians in the Southwest is that there's obviously very little water. Now, snakes and lizards don't need a huge amount of water, but other wildlife that they eat do. They're prey species. And so often the best places to find these species are near the washes. So either at a time of year when there is water and those riverbeds have water in them, or this time of year when they're dry, they're just called washes. They're little creeks and riverbeds and things. And so you tend to get more vegetation. So there's more structure for animals to hide in, both prey and the amphibian and reptile species. And so there just tends to be, things tend to congregate around these areas. And so one of the better ways to find snakes and lizards are to just find these washes and just walk along them. And it's actually it makes for nice walking too, because you have kind of a clear path as opposed to trying to push through shrubs and cacti. That being said, most of this landscape is pretty open. And so at this particular wash, this is another site that Brian, the rattlesnake expert, had sent us out to just go look around. He said it was just a good area to just explore. And so this is a western diamondback rattlesnake we found near that wash. We actually found 2 while we were out there, which was very exciting. This is kind of one of the iconic, the western diamondback and eastern diamondback, sort of the iconic rattlesnake that a lot of people will think of and that you'll often see in the movies. And this would have been the first individual that I saw. So I was very excited to find that. And I actually found this particular snake a little bit uncharacteristically. It was under a sign. So where we parked, while people were still getting their bags and their gear and their sunscreen and whatever on, I was ready to go. And so I just was wandering around and I found this, it was a road sign or something that had fallen over, and I flipped it up and the snake was just sitting under it. So before we'd even started our hike. So that was pretty exciting. We also went out, this was back in South Mountain, at night for just a little walk. There's some nice trails in there, like paved trails. So another really good way to find reptiles, particularly reptiles, but amphibians as well in the Southwest, as well as in the tropics. The supplies in most areas is to go out at night. These animals are often a lot more active at night because even for these species, the daytime temperatures get too warm. So they're often hiding under cover, under shrubs, in little caves underground, and they often come out at night and move around a lot more at night. And so a really good way to find these species is to go out at night with a flashlight and just walk around, or to go road cruising, driving along the road. You're essentially surveying transects and being able to move fairly quickly because you're in a car. And so any of these animals that are on the move, you find them while they're crossing the road or out crossing the trail. So anyway, this was the Sonoran Desert night snake. We do have night snakes in Canada and BC. It's a different subspecies in British Columbia. And you can see from the photo down there in the bottom left, this is just a tiny little snake. They do get bigger, a little bit bigger, but they're a small snake. We found 2 or 3 that night. And this is just a little camel spider, just a cool little invert that almost looks like a cross between, it's an arachnid. It looks like, it's not a true spider, I don't think. It's sort of a cross between a arachnid and a scorpion and a spider. Just a funny looking little thing that I felt take a photo of. And this was really neat. This is, I believe it's a banded gecko. I don't think I even put the name on the screen here. But it was almost, it's hard to tell in the lighting, but it was almost sort of fluorescent colored. It was pretty neat. And this was a juvenile. And we found 2 of these as well. And these were just tiny. These were probably only about 2 inches, 3 inches in length. So again, it's a lot of just standing pretty still and shining the light around and just looking for things as they're moving around. So I mentioned road cruising. Brian, the local rattlesnake expert that we got in touch with, also offered to take us out road cruising. He had a road that he knew would be pretty good for rattlesnakes. And so we went out with them and we found a number of rattlesnakes, which was very exciting. This is a Mojave rattlesnake. It was the only Mojave rattlesnake we saw on that particular trip. And this is just a close-up of that, or one of the individuals. I think we saw 3 Mojaves once we'd moved it across the road. And we saw several sidewinders as well. Again, this is the only time, and this is the only time I've seen the species. So it was, again, going out with the local rattlesnake expert who knew of a good road where there was a rattlesnake population and where he thought they'd be on the move. And so we found the Mojave and the sidewinders. So that was great. This is a little sidewinder. So you can see the size, like these aren't huge snakes. I mean, they certainly get bigger than that, but most of the sidewinders were around that size, maybe a little bigger. And this one just would not move. It was just coiled up on the road, probably just soaking up a little bit of heat because you go road cruising shortly after the sun sets. I think it was a little bit later than that by this time, but either way, it was just content to sit where it was. And we were poking it and just trying to get it off the road and it wouldn't move. So John went and found a little like old fence post and just kind of scooped it up like a shovel and just carried it off the road. Okay, another spot that I found while I was down there that I really enjoy, I've gone back to on both trips and I'll go back again when I'm down there, is Sabino Canyon. And Sabino Canyon, well, it's called Sabino Canyon Recreation Area. It's part of the Coronado National Forest, and it's on the edge of Tucson. It's basically on the city limits of Tucson and on the edge of the Coronado National Forest. So that forest is large and extends quite a ways north and east from Tucson. And so again, this was a case where we had a hotel, just stayed at a Comfort Inn or something, and we rolled out of bed, had breakfast, hopped in the car, and it was about 3 intersections away was the recreation area in the parking lot. So it took about 10 minutes to get there. But because it's on the edge of a national forest and it's managed and maintained for wildlife, it was just a magical place. Like there were so many things to find there. And very, very beautiful. Like this whole landscape was incredible. So often we would just kind of fan out a little bit and walk along the trails and just search for little critters running around. These are some greater earless lizards that we found. We found quite a few of these. Just so that this talk doesn't go all night, I'm usually just including 1 or 2 representative photos of each species. But these were 2 individuals that were just hanging out, a male and a female, on a rock. made for kind of a nice photograph. And this is a eastern collared lizard. Sorry. Again, very colorful, lots of greens and turquoise and yellow. Some of these critters are very, very colorful and just really pretty. This is the only individual of this species I've seen, so I'm glad I got a few nice photographs of it. A little bit less colorful, but nonetheless interesting is the desert spiny lizard. There are 3 different species of spiny lizard: the desert, the yarrows, and the Clarks. And so across the 3 trips, and I think on each trip, we saw all 3, but this is the desert spiny. It tends to be at the lowest elevations and the warmest ecosystems, habitats. And we were very excited to find a little juvenile Sonoran desert tortoise. So this is small. This is, I don't know, maybe the shell is about 2 inches in length. Like I'm really zoomed in on this individual. So this is a very small, very, very cute little tortoise. And so we were very excited to find that. It was just sort of hanging out by some rocks. And so these are all in the Sabino Canyon recreation area. A round-tailed ground squirrel. These were scurrying all over the place, so I had to get a few photos of them. Good rattlesnake food. And so these canyons, Sabino Canyon, and there are a number of side canyons, which are all riverbeds. And so at this time of year, we were there in, oh gosh, I don't remember. Well, the time of year we were there, the river, there hadn't been much rain. We were there in late August, I think, both years, or both trips. And so you would get these little residual pools of water in these riverbeds in the bottom of the canyon. And so again, much like the washes, you'd get a lot of wildlife congregated around these areas. You get a lot of green, lush vegetation compared to, you can sort of see in the background there, a lot of the rest of the area is quite dry and open, full of cacti. And so again, the trails through these canyons often kind of weave through the canyon bottom back and forth. And so you're able to get really close to these environments that are great for reptiles and amphibians. And so this is a Sonoran desert toad. We saw them sort of throughout the area. They're not just around the water, but this particular one was right by one of those little pools. This is the canyon tree frog. Was not expecting to find tree frogs. There are species that they do have to keep relatively moist skin, but again, they hang out by the water where the little bit of water persists. And a black-necked garter snake. We did not see many garter snakes on either of our trips, and the ones that we did find like this, so this is quite a fairly aquatic species in Arizona, and garter snakes and rattlesnakes are sort of flipped from what we have up here. Down in Arizona, the garter snakes tend to be quite rare, and you have to really work to find them, whereas you're tripping over rattlesnakes. And up here, obviously in Ontario, we have a lot of garter snakes, and the Massasauga is a little bit trickier to find. And the same goes out in Western Canada, where the Western rattlesnake and in the prairies, the prairie rattlesnake can be a bit tough to find, but the garter snakes are quite abundant. So yeah, down here in Arizona, it was interesting to see that kind of in reverse. I think on our first trip down, we saw about 9 or 10 Western diamondback rattlesnakes by the time all was said and done, plus all those other rattlesnake species. So the number of rattlesnake individuals we saw was probably in the ballpark of 15 to 20 at least on just the one trip, whereas this was the only garter snake we found. This is the red-spotted toad. This little guy was just hopping around in the leaf litter. And an American bullfrog, which is not native on the West Coast, including all the way down to Arizona. They're introduced and invasive and a bit of a problem. And so at the time of year that we were there, so I guess our first trip, I think we were there in the spring, in April, and the second trip we were there in August. A lot of the cacti were in flower, which was really pretty. We had just missed the large saguaro cactus, but you can see some of the flowers are still out there, but a lot of the cacti were in flower, and it's really quite pretty, the landscape. This was just sort of the view we would have often hiking through on the trails through the various canyons. Little barrel cactus there in the front with some flowers. And, prickly pear cactus on the right. So again, just an example of another one of the washes that we were walking down and exploring. So in the big canyons, you're just down in the canyon beds, and then all those big canyons have little side tributaries, which are sort of these washes. So you can kind of fork and explore whichever direction you'd like. This was on our second trip, and in one of those washes along the side, there were these little holes in the side of the rock, and I thought, you know, I'll have a look in those. And so I took my flashlight, and the first one I looked in, there was a desert tortoise, a large desert tortoise. So that was extremely exciting because this is the first adult that I'd seen. It's just the wasps were very colorful. It was very hot by the time I took this photograph. It was usually we would try to hike from about 7 a.m. until 11 o'clock noon, and then take a break in the afternoon, and then head out again after dinner for an early evening and then a night hike, because it was just too hot during the heat of the day. And so this wasp and all the other wasps in this area, it's hard to tell from the photo, but it's actually sitting on some water, and it's just hanging out on the water having a drink. And while I was taking photos of that wasp cooling itself off, the rest of my crew was over in the shade hanging out waiting for me, also having some water. But yeah, like it was, we had to be careful to not go too far and to be back before it got too hot, because you can get in trouble if you hike too far out and it gets too hot and you run out of water. This is a zebra-tailed lizard. They were sort of across both trips all over the place. Pretty little lizard with a striped tail, hence the name. And this is a whiptail, a desert grassland whiptail in this case. These things can be really tricky to get photos of. All these lizards, like I'm getting pretty close with my macro lens, and they don't usually let you do that. So, you know, every 9 or 10 times I try, I'll actually get the photos. The other 9 or 10 times I scurry off. This one in particular, I was chasing these around for quite a while. Not chasing them around, you know, wandering around trying to get close enough. And this one had turned and looked the other way. And so I literally snuck up on it, got down on my hands and knees and just snuck up really slowly and quietly. And then eventually when it turned around, I was already right there. I got a few photos and then it scurried off. So one of the tricks, I guess, if you can manage to sneak up on these things. This is a Clark's spiny lizard. I'd mentioned that there are 3 different species of spiny lizard. So this is another one. And a tarantula. Tarantulas everywhere. So I think I've only included 1, maybe 2 photos of tarantulas in the slideshow tonight. It was very difficult to go out at night for a night hike without seeing several. There was one night we were road cruising where every few hundred meters, every kilometer at least, tarantula, and just kind of swerve around to make sure we didn't hit it, just crossing the road. Very, very common out at night, just out hiking or walking around. So tarantulas are generally not very dangerous to humans. They're a big spider. And so, you know, a little spider we have here, like a house spider, if it bites you, you get a little reaction. So a tarantula is big. If it bites you, you get a big reaction, but it's not the sort of thing that's life-threatening. The movies really blow it out of proportion. Not that I am wandering around picking them up, because that's not my thing, but it is kind of neat to see these gigantic spiders just out walking around. This one actually was during the day, but most of them were at night. Again, just one of the flowers on the barrel cactus. And this is a desert king snake with a very excited herpetologist. This was on one of our night walks so we did night walks most nights in Sabino Canyon. Again, because it was so close to our hotel, the great big parking lot, some of the main trails are paved, the side ones are well maintained, so it's really easy and really safe to go out walking at night because you can see where you're going. And we didn't actually find much on this particular hike, and I think we were just out a little bit too early. And as we were heading back to the car, I shone the light over, and the snake was just crawling along right beside the trail. So that was an extremely exciting find. And that's a close-up. The photograph didn't turn out very well, unfortunately. But it was neat to see that species. So we also spent, I mentioned the night hikes. We also spent a fair bit of time while we were in the Tucson area, just driving around at night, going on road cruises. Because again, we were near the edge of the city, and there were a lot of different natural areas, campgrounds, parks, rural roads that were just sort of gravel roads that had very low traffic volumes that we felt comfortable road cruising on. So just out driving around looking for things crossing the road at night. And in particular, one night we were specifically looking for a tiger rattlesnake because we hadn't found one yet. This was our second trip. We hadn't seen one yet, and it was a species that we wanted to try to find. And we got lucky and found one crossing the road. We found about 3 diamondback rattlesnakes first, and then the tiger rattlesnake. It's tricky to tell from this photo because it's a juvenile, and you can see there the rattle only has about 6 segments on it, so it's a younger snake. But their head is really disproportionately small compared to the body, especially like a big adult. It's really noticeable. They have this tiny little funny head and this huge body, but they're also very colorful snake. One of the trails at Sabino Canyon, Bear Canyon, which is sort of the second largest canyon and associated trails, it used to have a paved road, which is what they're walking on here, what used to be paved, with a little shuttle that would take you down to the trailhead, which is about 1.5 kilometers from the main parking area. And over the years, they were just finding that there was too much roadkill. So they got rid of it. They unpaved the road and they got rid of the little shuttle. And so if you want to hike there now, walking down that road is basically the first 1.5 kilometers of the hike, which is, just as great as walking along a trail, really. This is the canyon bed of Bear Canyon. And so you can just see how open and rocky it is. And so during the rainy season, this would be full of water and flowing. But in this particular trip, when this photo was taken, it was August, so it was quite dry. And again, there were those few little puddles and pools in certain areas. And there's a dam down at the bottom that was pretty full of water. But aside from that, it was dry. And so we could just kind of hike around looking for things there. And on this particular hike, we found another desert tortoise. This one here is eyeing up that flower and then eating the flower. It was actually, before we came across it, where it was just grabbing the flower, it was chowing down on prickly pear cactus fruit. And so you can see in this photograph, its face is all stained red. And that's because it was eating the prickly pear cactus fruit. So we passed a couple of hikers that told us there was a tortoise down on the trail a few hundred meters down. So we kind of ran down to find it. And when they saw it, it was eating the prickly pear. By the time we got there, it had moved on to chomping on some flowers. But that was pretty cool to see. And so when we're walking through the canyon bottoms and the washes, you're usually not going to find much right out in the open, like in the open sandy areas and the open stuff. Same thing here in Ontario and in Canada. The reptiles and amphibians are typically in areas where there's going to be more cover, but often at those edges, areas that are still going to be warm, getting lots of light, but have some cover. And so the areas we would be sort of searching, I don't have anything on here on the screen to show, maybe I can use my mouse. Sort of along these edges here where the rocks meet the edge and you get some vegetation that provides cover, that's the area we would generally be focusing our searches on. In this particular case, we found another tiger rattlesnake right down there. I'm assuming you can see my mouse on the shared screen. But in any case, we found a tiger rattlesnake. This is John with a hook, just showing that. So you can see the size of it there. Again, it's not a huge snake. This is the coach whip. We found 3 or 4 coach whips on our second trip. I think I saw one on the first trip, but it was so fast I couldn't tell what it was. It's an extremely fast snake, sort of similar to our blue racer that we have here in Ontario, in that their best defense is to just shoot off in the opposite direction as soon as you get too close. And the coach whips, I think, are even faster. But what was really interesting about this and all of the coach whips we found was that when we did see them, and we never once saw them sitting still. You don't see them until they're shooting off. They all went up into the shrubs, and that was sort of how they got away. And that seemed to be their predator avoidance, was getting up into a shrub. So that was sort of interesting. I don't know that they all do it necessarily, but all 3 that we got a look at and were able to follow for a little bit all went up into the shrubs. I mentioned we find lots of other things, creepy crawlies out there while we're looking for reptiles and amphibians. Now in Arizona, you don't look under cover as much as you do up here in Canada. In Canada, if you're looking for reptiles, 5-line skink, for example, and all the snakes, you're really needing to look under cover for most species except for the Massasauga, because they bask more out in the open. In Arizona, things are just out and about. They're not really hiding under cover that much. And most of the cover they're in or under is tricky to search, and there's just rocks everywhere, so you can't really search under it. So my experience has been that you're not really looking under cover as much for things. But when you do, you often find scorpions or spiders or things like that. So I have a few photos of those in here. These are some scorpions that were out along one of the rock ledges. One female with the young there on her back, and the other one, which I'm assuming is trying to eat the young, but I'm not entirely sure. So that was just sort of neat to see. That's just a close up there of the little, I think they're cute, little cute hatchling scorpions on the mother's back. So there is parental care, as far as I know, in these species, and a lot of spiders too. Now, something that's really neat about scorpions is that when you look for them at night with a black light, well, first of all, so when you look at them at night with a black light, they fluoresce, exceptionally so, and at quite a distance. And so if you don't like the idea that there are scorpions all over the place, don't go out at night with a black light and shine it around, because you will see scorpions everywhere. They are just everywhere. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little, but you can walk along the trail and there's one. That, like, they really kind of, I mean, they're in a bit, right? They're invertebrates. Like, invertebrates are super numerous. It's just they're small and they're camouflaged and they're hard to see. But if you have a black light and they glow like this, they're pretty easy to see. So it's neat, and it's a trick that people who are out working with or looking for scorpions will use. So I've talked a lot about the Tucson area and Sabino Canyon. We did a little quick trip down to Green Valley at one point, and went out hiking for a morning in the Madrean Sky Island forest. So the Madrean forest. So it's just East Launchie down there in the southwest in Arizona and southern Mexico. There's all these mountains, and as you go up in elevation, the ecosystems change, and you get into more of these forested ecosystems. And they're referred to as sky islands because they're these forests up in the mountains that are very, very different from all the surrounding landscape down in the bottomlands, which is all desert and scrubland. So we spent a morning hiking around here. We didn't find too much as far as reptiles and amphibians go. There were always lots of lizards scurrying around. This is the Yarrow's spiny lizard, so the third species of spiny lizard, which is a higher elevation species. And this individual was just, as a lot of lizards we would see down there doing, just hanging out on the rocks in the sun, basking and, well, sleeping, resting, just chilling in the sun. And this is another whiptail. I don't have the species name written down here, and there's a huge number of them, and they're tricky to identify. I'm sure I did at the time, but I don't recall offhand which one this is. And we also, at one point on our first trip, took a little trip down to right near the U.S. border, Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, just another park, another area to explore. And so these are the Oregon Pipes cactus. Pretty neat cacti. Another desert iguana. Just spiky cacti. This is not the Oregon pipe cactus. It's just another cactus. But just constantly watching where you're going when you're down there, and not entirely for, I mean, yes, for rattlesnakes, but there's just cactus everywhere. And this was a long-nosed snake that we were treated to after one of our road cruising trips in the evening. We'd gone out, we found very little. I think we found a road-killed western diamondback rattlesnake. And we got back to the hotel and just found this behind the hotel on the hotel grounds. I say hotel, it was like a little, like 3-room tiny place. So this was an interesting individual to find, very colorful. Again, the photo is not great, but it was a very colorful snake. So we just, one of the trails just kind of followed the canyon along, just spent the day out hiking. Off to the Oregon pipe cactus. We actually had one point as we were returning to the car where there just was all of a sudden this loud buzzing sound, and it just got closer and closer. And it was a huge swarm of what I believe were killer bees that basically passed through. And we'd gotten back to the cars by then and we're in the cars, but it was kind of interesting and weird. But it was a huge swarm. A couple little fluffies, a rock squirrel and a desert cottontail that were out scurrying around. Butterflies. Just again, really picturesque, interesting landscapes down there. And they sort of look barren, like when there's not a lot of trees, but when you zoom in on any one place, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of life. There's a lot of different species. It's just not a lush rainforest kind of diversity. Oh, so here's my token bird. I believe this is a crested caracara, which we saw on the drive between Organ Pipe and Tucson. So we did have a birder in our group on both trips. They were looking up, I was looking down. And often, a lot of the times, the birds, I just wasn't able to get, they were too far away. You needed binoculars or a scope, and my camera wasn't really great for that. So that's why I don't have a lot of the bird photos. But we did, this was on the highway. We actually turned around and went back because they saw it and they were 75% sure that's what it was. And so we went around and got a good look at it. Okay, and on our last trip in 2019, we spent a week in the Chiricahua Mountains. We went with another friend and colleague who had gone to this spot a few times. I was excited to go back. There were two species of rattlesnakes, both high elevation, that live up in those Sky Island forests, two different species that he really wanted to see that he hadn't seen before, as well as a Gila monster, which he hadn't seen yet. So we spent a week here. This is sort of in extreme southeastern Arizona, right at the New Mexico border, is where this is. Paradise, Arizona is the town, if you can call it a town. It was kind of a collection of a few little houses here and there, and one little hotel restaurant. This is where we stayed. It was this photo does not do it justice. It was a nice little complex with about 3 different houses, and 2 of the houses were rental houses. And I don't remember what we paid. It wasn't very much. And we basically got 2 houses to ourselves for the group. So it was really nice, full kitchen and everything. So I would definitely stay there again if I went back. I wish I'd taken more photos because this photo is terrible, but so that's where we hung out. And then there were a couple trails and natural areas nearby. And the person we went with, his primary activity when he goes is road cruising at night. He'll go out for hikes during the day, but that's not really his thing. He's kind of when you meet some of these really hardcore herpetologists, that's what they do. They road cruise. And if you get lucky, you can see an incredible abundance of species. I mean, he was telling me in some years on a really good night, he would get 30 or 40 rattlesnakes in one night of just road cruising. We did not get those kinds of numbers. In Arizona, you need some rain to bring the species out, because if it's too hot and dry and there isn't any water, then the snakes, they just sort of estivate. They're not really out and about as much. And so the trip we went in April, we got lucky. We got some of the spring rains, and then there's normally another heavy rain in August that will bring a lot of things out again. And that rain never really happened the year we were there. It happened a little bit, but not as much as was necessary. So the numbers of things we were seeing were a little low, but they were still mind-blowingly high, like to me. To someone who's, I guess, gone many, many times and knows what really high numbers are, it seemed low, but we were still seeing a lot of wildlife. And so that was pretty neat, given that it was a bit of a down year. So yeah, road cruising, and unfortunately when you're road cruising, you do find dead things. We did not find as many as I thought we might, but this is a road-killed long-nosed snake. There were definitely a few rattlesnakes dead as well that we found. This is a Mojave rattlesnake. It was on the road. We kind of shoot it off, and then it kind of coiled up and posed very nicely for some photos. This is probably one of my favorite photos from those trips. Turned out really nicely. And that's the nice thing, about the rattlesnakes is they are very photogenic in most cases. Like sometimes if they just want to go, then they're just going to go. But in a lot of cases, if they decide they're going to coil up and hold their ground, which is one of their primary defensive behaviors, then you really can often get some nice photographs, which is nice. And this is a little juvenile Mojave rattlesnake. This is a Couch's spadefoot. We saw a number of spadefoot toads on these trips, which are a really neat species. Again, they really need the rain to come out because they're explosive breeders. They bury themselves underground. And then when they get those heavy rains in the spring and in August, they come out, they reproduce, they lay their eggs in like temporary puddles formed by the rain. They hatch and metamorphose out the eggs and the larvae in just a few days. So they're very explosive, and they spend most of their life buried underground. They're really neat. And so there are spadefoots across North America. We have a few in Canada in the prairies. But these ones were and you can see the little spade there in the bottom left photo on the foot. So that's what they use to dig, to excavate. They use their hind legs, and that little spade helps them dig up the ground. This is another one of the short-horned lizards. This is a round-tailed short-horned lizard, and it was tiny. It was maybe 1.5 to 2 inches in total length. So again, the macro lens makes it look really large, but it was quite a small lizard. And we found it because we stopped for something else. I think we stopped for a tarantula. I don't remember why. And we were just standing around, and someone looked down, and it was just there in the rocks, which is, again, how we find a lot of these things. If you're just standing still and look, sometimes you see things. So there's maybe the tarantula that we stopped for, or just another tarantula that we found. And this is a giant whip scorpion, also known as a vinegaroon. And you can, like, I haven't done as much of this as I would like in recent years, but you can have a lot of fun with inverts and a macro lens. You know, this is just a crazy little alien looking thing. But they're called vinegaroons because they excrete acetic acid if they're disturbed, and they smell like vinegar. And so that's another picture from more of a top down of what these little guys look like. That's a black widow spider. The photo I tried to take right before this, it was flipped the other way, and you could see the red hourglass on the belly, which was really neat. But unfortunately, that photo didn't turn out, and then it turned around. And this is a giant desert centipede. It was huge. Like, it was maybe not a foot long, but close. Like, it's a big, kind of creepy looking thing, and really colorful. And very, very poisonous as far as I know. Venomous, very venomous as far as I know. Another one of the scorpions, the Arizona bark scorpion. This is the western diamondback rattlesnake that we found out road cruising. A Mexican spadefoot, so different species of spadefoot. The Great Plains toad. So this would be more closely related to our American toad, like it would be in the genus Bufo, or now Anaxyrus. This is a coach whip up in a tree. So again, another coach whip up in a tree. When we first thought, we thought it was a rat snake and got a little bit excited. And then maybe we're a little disappointed to find it was just a coach whip, but it was still a neat find. So there it is there. Okay, and so as I've mentioned, two of the target species for this this leg of this particular little trip were these two montane rattlesnakes, the twin-spotted rattlesnake and the banded rock rattlesnake, both small rattlesnake species, maybe the size of a Massasauga, and again, high elevation. So to get to this particular one, we drove up this very windy, fairly sketchy, something you might expect a bit more in like a Central South American country, a little narrow dirt road that kind of wound back and forth up a mountain. And I'm not a big fan of heights, so it was maybe a little bit scarier for me than others, but it was very, very scenic. Just sometimes you'd look out the window and it would just be down. Like, there were no guardrails, nothing like that. So we basically wound our way up this mountain took about close to an hour by the time we got there. And we had it on good authority from someone who had done his PhD research down there on one of those spiny lizard species. This was one of his research sites, but it's also a well-known twin-spotted rattlesnake hibernation site. And so he told us that the best way to find this species is just head out and search around the even during the summer, like they still hang out in the same habitat around the hibernation site. And so this was sort of the goal for getting up there and searching around this den site. When we got there, we found this sign that had been posted telling people that at certain times of the year, including the time we were there, that it was illegal to go up on the site or you'd be charged and thrown in jail and pay a massive, massive fine. And this was unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, I'll get back to that. This was unfortunately new in the year between the time he had done his PhD and the time that we showed up, because this wasn't, there was no restriction when he was working up there for a few years. It's a good thing in the end, because the reason this was done is to protect the habitat and the species, because it's a very rare species. And so it's a subject of poaching and illegal trafficking, which is an issue we have here again in Ontario with some of our species, spotted turtle and wood turtle, for example. Same issues there. And I guess enforcement, we're having too much of a hard time catching or deterring people or charging people, catching them in the act, I guess. So it was just easier to say, don't go on the slope. And if you're on the slope, you're going to get charged. So we couldn't go up there and look around. And in hindsight, we should have spent a bit more time just searching around. So sort of at the bottom of the slope was a campground and a few trails. We should have just poked around down there. We probably would have found them, but I think 2 members of the group were pretty bummed out. And so we ended up kind of just heading back down the mountain and thinking, well, maybe we'll come back sometime in the time of year we're allowed up there. But yeah, like I said, in hindsight, we should have just searched around because I think we probably would have found one. But we did stop on the way down to just take in the views. So Steve there is pointing at a lizard on the rocks. And it was this one, another Clark's spiny lizard. And we didn't stop for the lizard. Again, I forget why we stopped, but then while maybe we stopped to search the rocky areas because he'd suggested that would be a good spot to find them. So the next morning we headed out to a different trail for the other species, the banded rock rattlesnake. And so this was a nice lowland area. There was a campground nearby with some trails and then a trail that we could basically follow to the area that the rattlesnake was known to be found in. This is another one of the Euro spiny lizards that we found along the way. And another one was the subject of a research study. This is number 153. I assume it's the subject of a research study as opposed to someone just going around catching and putting numbers on lizards. This is a little striped plateau lizard that again was pretty groggy, sleepy, just out basking in the sun. It's a little juvenile. It was quite small. So we're headed into this canyon. So it seemed like it was a bit lower elevation than the other site we'd gone to up in the mountains. But basically the trail just sort of wound through this canyon. And again, there was a hibernation site that we were looking for that Steve knew about that we were going to go and try to poke around. And again, we're seeing this sort of higher elevation ecosystem, that Madrean forest, and whether or not this is quite the Madrean or something else, but areas that would look a little bit more like what you might expect to find here in Canada as opposed to down in Arizona. Lots of trees and vegetation and forest floor. And right down in the canyon bottom, though, there was still a little bit of water running through the creek, but otherwise it was a pretty big open expanse, lots of areas to look around. We ended up somehow wandering right by the den site that we were looking for. And on the way back, it was very obvious. So I don't know how we missed it. But we wandered way past it and then eventually decided we'd gone past it and just turned back and decided to start looking around a little bit more carefully on the way back. And so we fanned out and we're just kind of, I mean, as we would have been doing anyway, but specifically with the rattlesnakes in mind. This is just another shot from the canyon bottom looking up. A lot of the rock was really sort of reddish colored, which was really nice. And under this log, as John stepped over it, he heard a rattle. And he called everyone over, and then we lifted the log and there was nothing there. And what ended up happening was that while he was waiting for everyone to come over, the rattlesnake moved without rattling, which is a little bit unusual, along the underneath the log and into that pile of branches and scrub at the end there. And so everyone else kind of just, I don't know, gave up pretty easily, but I was poking around the logs and branches quite a while and eventually found the snake. And it was not sitting like this at the time. It was down in under all the logs and branches, and I could basically see like a few of the little blotches on part of the body. That was all I could see. So I called everyone back and everyone was able to see a little glimpse of it. But as we just kind of were there, just seeing it, it was moving around throughout that mess of branches. And on its own accord, it came out to the edge and sat and coiled. It was still not at the edge as this photo might make it seem. I had to really kind of scooch around some branches to get this shot. But I was very, very excited to get this. And Steve was over the moon excited to have seen the species. So that was pretty neat. It's always nice when you go out looking for something and actually find it. This is just an excited group of herpetologists after having seen that. And then just as our excitement was probably still pretty high, we went out road cruising that night. It was our last night in the Chiricahuas, and the last night of Steve's trip. And his fourth or fifth, he still had not seen a Gila monster. And as we were driving out to go road cruising, this little guy was crossing the road. So this is the Gila monster. It's one of the only, I think it's one of 2 venomous lizard species. And it's pretty large. They can get pretty large. I don't remember exactly how big this one was. Maybe it was about a foot, a bit longer in length, probably a bit longer, but they're really heavy, like they're a pudgy lizard. And the scalation, is, you can see it almost looks like little beads. So just very different than most other lizards. Really, really neat find. And so we were very excited to see that. I should mention, there are only, so we had, when we went down for this trip, we purchased the Arizona fishing hunting license, which authorizes you to basically capture and hunt and take virtually most of the reptile amphibian species down there, with the exception of a few that are state protected. Those rattlesnakes, the high elevation rattlesnakes, are protected. You're not allowed to harass or capture or handle those, and the Gila monsters as well. So we just took a few shots of it on the road and then scooched it off the road and went on our way. That and those 2 rattlesnakes, we weren't handling. I mean, we wouldn't necessarily have been handling them anyway, but I just thought I would mention that. And this is a black-tailed rattlesnake that we found after the Gila monster as we were out road cruising. A very, very colorful, pretty rattlesnake. And this is a bigger rattlesnake, kind of getting into like the Western diamondback size, not quite, but a large snake, a few feet in length at least. This individual might have been 4 feet. And here's another Western diamondback rattlesnake. A lot of the Western diamondback rattlesnakes in the Chiricahuas, I found had a very like pinkish hue to them, like a really neat coloration, compared to more of the browns and grays we were finding in Tucson. And I think that's it for that talk. So this is the close-up of one of the diamondback rattlesnakes that we found just about to cross the road. Yeah, so I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone's got questions or discussion. And if you have questions about this trip and the critters we were finding, I'm sure there's lots of things I wanted to say that I didn't want to take too long. But also, if you have any questions about Ontario reptiles and amphibians, I'd be happy to chat about that as well.